When Chief Justice John Roberts mocked Senator John Kennedy's legal education in front of a stunned congressional hearing, no one expected the Louisiana senator to respond with a document that would shatter Roberts's carefully polished legacy. What began as a petty insult turned into one of the most devastating public reckonings in Supreme Court history, exposing not only a fabricated credential, but the quiet power of truth when wielded by someone underestimated. Stay with us as we unpack this moment of reckoning. You confuse courtroom antics with constitutional logic. Maybe Vanderbilt wasn't enough. The words landed like a gavel in a silent chamber. The Senate Judiciary Committee room, packed shoulder to shoulder with lawmakers, journalists, and staffers, seemed to stop breathing. Even the usual rustling of notes and shifting in seats froze. At the center of the storm sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his posture straight, voice steady, tone edged with surgical condescension. He had just, in full view of the American public, dismissed the legal education and intellect of Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. The insult wasn't subtle. It was designed to humiliate. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters' fingers hovered over keyboards, then exploded into motion. A moment earlier, the hearing had followed the usual patterns: policy disagreements, ideological skirmishes, carefully rehearsed exchanges. But Roberts's unprovoked attack had ripped through the fabric of decorum like a scalpel through silk. Some senators exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or watch history unfold. Kennedy, for his part, didn't blink. He sat completely still, his hands calmly folded on the table before him, the only movement a slight tilt of his head as if weighing the sting of the comment. No raised voice, no retort, just a long, deliberate pause. Then, almost casually, Kennedy reached down, opened his leather briefcase, and pulled out a dark green folder. The motion was smooth, unhurried, almost ceremonial. He placed it on the table, opened it with the care of someone disarming a device, and extracted a document sheathed in protective plastic. The committee room remained in that strange, suspended quiet, the kind that precedes something seismic. "Mr. Chief Justice," Kennedy began, his southern drawl as even as ever, but with a noticeable gravity now anchoring each word. "I hadn't planned to bring this up. I was going to stick to institutional questions. But since you decided to take a detour through my alma mater, I think we may need to revisit yours." The words weren't loud, but they carried. Their weight wasn't in volume, but in intent. He didn't raise the document yet. He simply let the sentence hang, the suggestion of consequence far more powerful than any outburst. Roberts leaned back slightly. Not much. Just enough to register a shift, one that the cameras would later replay in slow motion across cable news loops for days. His face remained impassive, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the sudden recalibration happening inside. The other senators, now fully alert, leaned in. Staffers stopped typing. Phones lifted to record. Kennedy continued, measured and calm. "You see," he said, fingers tapping lightly on the folder, "we've all got a past. Schools we went to, work we did, things we're proud of, and some things we maybe let others believe were a little shinier than they were." He paused again. It wasn't for drama. It was strategy giving the room, and Roberts, just enough space to think ahead, to realize what might be coming, and to dread it. "What's in this folder?" Kennedy said. "Isn't something I dug up. It was sent to my office 2 weeks ago by someone who used to work inside the records division at Harvard Law. They didn't want to smear anybody. They just wanted, and I quote, someone to ask what no one else seems willing to." Still, he didn't reveal the contents. He let the power remain in the anticipation. Instead, he looked directly at Roberts, making eye contact that was steady, but not aggressive, not performative. Just still. "Now I'm not interested in dragging people through the mud," Kennedy said. I figure we've got enough of that in politics already. But I do believe that when someone questions the legitimacy of another's education, especially in public, it's only fair to hold them to the same standard. You understand, sir? He said, sir. Not sarcastically. Not with venom. With formality. It was that formality that made it sting. Roberts gave the faintest nod. No words. Just an acknowledgement that something irreversible had begun. Kennedy returned his gaze to the folder. "I'll get to the contents shortly," he said. "But before I do, I want to make sure we're clear on something. I've never claimed to be the smartest fella in the room. I leave that to folks who need it more. But I do know right from wrong. And I know what integrity looks like when it's real, and when it's just dressed up in robes." The final sentence hung in the air like smoke. No one interrupted. No one shifted. The committee room, just moments ago buzzing with partisan energy, had been unified into a single focus. Whatever Kennedy was about to reveal, everyone knew it would matter. And Roberts knew it most of all. John Roberts had always been the embodiment of a particular American ideal, the polished, pedigreed product of the nation's most exclusive institutions. Born into comfort in Buffalo, New York, he'd walked a path paved by generations of men who looked like him and knew which doors to knock on, even when they were never locked in the first place. Harvard College had been his entry point, Harvard Law his launch pad. From there came the clerkships, the White House counsel's office, the appellate courts, and finally, the Summit Chief Justice of the United States. He was not merely respected, he was curated. Everything from the way he phrased dissenting opinions to the subtle pauses in his public remarks reflected a man schooled in control, presentation, and institutional preservation. His career had been built not just on legal ability, though that was never in question, but on knowing how to exist within systems that reward polish over disruption. Across from him, seated calmly, but with the air of a man holding something no one else did, sat Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. And Kennedy's path had been anything but curated. He was born in Centerville, Mississippi, and raised in Zachary, Louisiana. His parents were not power brokers. They didn't attend legacy banquets or send holiday cards to federal judges. Kennedy studied philosophy before pursuing law, not to impress, but because he wanted to understand how power worked and how it failed. He earned his law degree from the University of Virginia, then went on to complete a graduate program in civil law at Tulane. It was, by elite standards, an unconventional path, but to Kennedy, it was a practical one. He didn't want to be in the marble halls. He wanted to be in the places those halls overlooked. Early in his career, he worked cases no one wanted: property disputes in forgotten towns, civil defense for the poor, cases too messy or too hopeless for lawyers chasing prestige. He didn't chase clerkships, he chased justice that could breathe. And along the way, he learned that the law wasn't always designed to protect the right people. Sometimes it simply protected itself. There was a moment in his early 30s that would define his view of justice more than any classroom or court opinion ever could. At the time, he was working as an assistant attorney general for the state. It was a juvenile case. A black teenager, 14 years old, had been arrested for assaulting a white store owner in a town where that accusation carried its own weight long before trial. Kennedy had read the file. The evidence was thin, the timeline inconsistent. The boy's alibi, his grandmother's testimony that he had been at home with her, was dismissed in court as emotionally biased. Despite his misgivings, Kennedy let the case proceed, and the boy was convicted, sent to a juvenile detention center for 2 years. It was only later, months later, that a new witness came forward unconnected, credible, and firm in their account that the boy had been nowhere near the store at the time of the incident. The case collapsed. The conviction was overturned, but the damage was done. Kennedy never forgot the boy's face the day he was released. Not grateful, not relieved, just quiet, hollow. Something in him had gone missing. Years later, When offered a judgeship on the Louisiana State Bench, a prestigious post that many assumed would be the beginning of his ascent, Kennedy turned it down. He never spoke about the juvenile case publicly, but those close to him knew. He didn't want to sit in judgment unless he was absolutely sure he could bear the weight of every error, not just legal ones, human ones. This was the man now sitting across from Chief Justice Roberts. They were both lawyers. Both had argued the meaning of statutes, wrestled with constitutional ambiguities, and signed their names to interpretations of American law. But the similarities ended there. Roberts represented a tradition law as an institution to be preserved, guarded, protected from politics, and insulated from passion. Kennedy represented the people law too often forgot those whose names never appear in textbooks, whose cases don't set precedent, but who live every consequence of legal interpretation. So when Roberts took a swing at Kennedy's education, he wasn't just belittling a school. He was dismissing a philosophy, one that says legal authority doesn't come from marble buildings or honorary distinctions. It comes from understanding how law touches real lives, and whether it lifts them or leaves them behind. Kennedy didn't flinch because he'd spent his life knowing what it felt like to be underestimated, and what it meant to keep showing up anyway. And now, with one document in hand, he was ready to hold up a mirror to an entire system that had never once expected someone like him to hold it. Senator Kennedy leaned forward slightly, the green folder still closed in front of him. The room had not regained its rhythm. It pulsed now with a different kind of energy, quiet, watchful, waiting. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone had changed. Gone was the drawl's charm, the aw shucks cadence reporters like to quote. What replaced it was precise, clipped, and cold. "Mr. Chief Justice," he said, "I've read your past speeches. I remember one in particular from a judicial ethics symposium 10 years ago. You said, and I quote, 'Integrity is non-negotiable. It is the currency of judicial authority. Without it, our robes are just costumes.'" The words echoed. Even those who had heard the quote before now felt its weight differently. Kennedy let the silence expand just long enough for it to land. "Now I agree with that sentiment," he continued, "wholeheartedly, which is why I need to ask, does your own record, as submitted to this body during your confirmation, reflect that same standard of integrity you so strongly champion?" Roberts blinked. It was the first visible break in his composure. He didn't answer right away. Perhaps he hadn't expected Kennedy to come armed not just with documents, but with his own words. Kennedy didn't press. He let the silence turn awkward, then uncomfortable. When Roberts finally spoke, his voice was slower than before, measured but cooler. "Senator, I am proud of my academic and professional background. All relevant materials were submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, and I have no reason to believe they were inaccurate." Kennedy nodded. Once, not in agreement, but in recognition. He opened the green folder slowly, revealing a single page. He did not lift it up. Not yet. "I'd like to clarify something," he said. "This isn't a personal grudge. I don't wake up in the morning wondering what John Roberts put on his CV 20 years ago. But when someone questions the legitimacy of public service based on where someone studied law, that person invites a level of scrutiny they'd better be ready for." A murmur rippled through the chamber, quickly hushed. Kennedy's voice grew more pointed now, not louder, just sharper. "I reviewed your confirmation packet. Mr. Chief Justice, it includes a line stating you were awarded the Henry Clay Academic Honor given, supposedly, to the top academic performer at Harvard Law that year. Accept Harvard's records." He tapped the folder without raising the document. "Do not list you as the recipient." Roberts opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flicked briefly to someone seated behind the committee dais, perhaps legal counsel, perhaps no one in particular. Kennedy didn't give him room to redirect. He went on. "It also claims," he said, "you served as managing editor of the Harvard Law Review. Again, their records indicate you were on the editorial board. Yes, but not in a managing role." Roberts's jaw clenched, not overtly, but enough for the cameras. He shifted in his seat, leaned forward, and for the first time, his tone dropped its polish. "Senator," he said, "I don't know what point you're trying to make. If your aim is to accuse me of misrepresenting decades-old credentials, then you should say so directly, instead of playing games with paperwork." Kennedy paused. Then he smiled, not broadly, not smugly, just enough to make clear he had expected this turn. "No games here," he said. "Just questions." Which, last I checked, was the whole point of this hearing. Roberts exhaled audibly, a short burst of breath that was not quite a sigh but too sharp to ignore. Kennedy continued, "I'm not accusing you of anything, sir. Yet, I'm asking whether the information you submitted under oath matches what your alma mater confirms. Because if integrity is indeed non-negotiable, then I think it's fair to ask, why do your records seem to be negotiating with the truth?" There it was, the question, not shouted, not weaponized, simply placed, like a blade on the table between them. The room held its breath. And for the first time in years, the Chief Justice of the United States found himself on the receiving end of a line of questioning that could not be deflected by status, by ceremony, or by silence. "Let's take our time with this next part," Senator Kennedy said, voice steady but quieter now, as if inviting the room to lean in rather than press forward. He lifted the page from the folder carefully and held it between his fingers, not dramatically, not waving it in the air, but with the measured control of someone handling something delicate. "This," he said, "is a certified statement from the Registrar's Office at Harvard Law School. It was provided through a formal records request and independently verified by committee staff. The letter confirms that no such award as the Henry Clay Academic Honor existed in 1979 or any other year." He paused. "Let it sink. It also confirms," he added, "that the award referenced in your confirmation documents submitted to this very committee in 2005 was never given to you because it was never created. The title was, in the registrar's words, unfamiliar, unlisted, and not institutionally recognized." He set the page down, not slammed, just placed. No one in the chamber moved. Not a pen, not a chair. Roberts sat with his hands now gripping the edge of the witness table. His face remained composed, but the stillness was different now. It wasn't control. It was tension tight, visible, and growing heavier by the second. Kennedy reached for the next document. "This second page," he said, "is an internal email dated July 14, 2005, from a staff member who at the time worked in the Office of Legal Counsel to the White House. The email references a request from a senior staffer to elevate language on Roberts's academic summary for clarity and emphasis, specifically to highlight distinctions and leadership roles in a way that would be, quote, more befitting of a Supreme Court nominee." Another pause. Not indulgent. Intentional. "Now look," Kennedy said, still composed, "we all know what polish looks like in politics. We all know people dress up their resumes. But there's a line between polish and fiction, especially when that fiction ends up in a Senate confirmation packet. Under oath." Roberts remained silent. He had not touched the microphone in front of him for minutes now. Kennedy wasn't done. "What makes this especially difficult," he said, "is not just the embellishment, it's the consequence." He turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to invite someone to briefly address the committee." The chairman nodded, clearly aware this had been coordinated in advance, but with no sense of what was coming. From the second row behind the staff benches, a woman stood and stepped forward. She was petite, dressed conservatively in a navy blue blazer, and carried a slim folder of her own. Her nameplate was already set at the witness table, Rachel H. Lynn. Kennedy introduced her. "Ms. Lynn graduated from Harvard Law School in 1979, the same year as Chief Justice Roberts. At the time, she was ranked number 1 in her graduating class. She did not receive the nomination for the academic distinction listed in Roberts's confirmation, because that distinction, as we've learned, was redirected unofficially, informally, and without explanation. Lynn took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and spoke in a voice so calm it startled. "I never intended to speak publicly about this," she began. "For many years, I believed the issue was bureaucratic, or that I had misunderstood the criteria. It was not until I was contacted by a Senate staffer last month that I learned the honor had been fabricated and attributed to someone else in official records." She paused, breathed. The room was pin-drop silent. "In 1980, she continued, I applied for a Supreme Court clerkship. My academic record was exceptional. My professors supported me. I made it to the final round before being passed over. I was told off the record that another candidate's academic distinctions and editorial leadership had tipped the scale." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes dropped for a moment as she added, "I later found out that candidate was John Roberts." Kennedy didn't move. He let her speak. Lynn straightened her notes. "I've had a successful legal career. I've taught, argued, written, but the truth matters. Because when history is recorded based on false achievements, it erases the people who earned them." She closed her folder. "I'm not here for retribution. I'm here for correction." She stood, nodded to the committee, and returned to her seat. Kennedy turned back to Roberts. His voice had softened now, not from pity, but from weight. "You see, Mr. Chief Justice," he said, "when someone borrows honor they didn't earn, it's not just a matter of pride. It reshapes careers. It shifts opportunities. It tells young lawyers that truth matters less than narrative. And that, sir, is where integrity stops being rhetorical and starts being real." Roberts said nothing. The cameras had stopped looking for his reaction. They were focused now on the documents on the table, on Ms. Lynn's face, on Kennedy's tone, on the air that had grown heavy with something more than scandal. It was history, not made by shouting, but by precision, by calm, by facts that no longer bent beneath the weight of status. Kennedy reached for the green folder again, closed it gently. "I have no interest in ruining reputations," he said quietly, "but I have every interest in protecting the integrity of this institution. And when that integrity is compromised, when titles are fabricated, when honors are assigned like ornaments, we lose something bigger than one man's resume. We lose public trust." He didn't need to say more. The room understood, and in the stillness that followed, it became clear to everyone present, including John Roberts himself, that the hearing had turned, not against a man, but against a mythology. And the truth, long buried beneath prestige and polish, had finally found its voice. The committee recessed for 15 minutes. No one moved quickly. There were no side conversations, no excited chatter. Even the reporters, usually the first to dart toward their phones, stood still for a few moments before walking out into the corridor, their faces already half drawn into headlines they hadn't written yet. When they returned, Chief Justice Roberts was no longer alone at the witness table. Beside him sat the court's legal counsel, a woman with a calm face and a briefcase full of damage control. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was an acknowledgement that the morning's narrative had cracked beyond repair. Roberts looked different, not disheveled, not broken, but older, like something had been taken out of him and not returned. The chairman called the session back to order and offered Roberts the floor for a statement. He leaned into the microphone slowly, the motion stiff, rehearsed yet strained. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. His voice, usually so crisp it could cut glass, was quieter now, rougher. "I've reviewed the documents presented by Senator Kennedy and the statements made by Ms. Lynn. I have also spoken with counsel and initiated contact with Harvard Law School to verify the discrepancies. It appears there are, in fact, inconsistencies between the records submitted during my confirmation process and the official institutional archives." He paused, not for effect, but to collect himself. "I cannot, at this time, account for how these misstatements entered the record. I was not directly involved in the compilation of those materials. That said, here his voice caught just slightly, a fractional hesitation that would be played and replayed for days. That said, as the nominee, the responsibility was ultimately mine, and I accept that responsibility. A camera click broke the silence like a dropped pin. Roberts didn't look toward it. He kept his eyes forward but unfocused, fixed somewhere between the desk and the void. I also want to address my earlier comments regarding Senator Kennedy's education. He continued, they were inappropriate, they were dismissive, and they were not consistent with the standards I have tried to uphold throughout my judicial career. His hands, which had been clasped together tightly on the table, slowly opened, palms down, fingers splayed, a gesture not of surrender, but exposure. I apologize, he said, to the senator, to this committee, and to the public. Then he stopped speaking. The microphone clicked faintly as he leaned back. He did not shift in his chair. He did not look up. There was no applause, no murmurs, only the sound of a paper being lifted somewhere in the gallery. Senator Kennedy didn't smile. He didn't lean forward. He waited a moment before responding. His voice was low and even, shaped by something more human than victory. Mr. Chief Justice, he said, I'm not looking for perfect. I never was. What I needed was honest. Another pause, this one not heavy, but clarifying. You gave it today, eventually. He didn't add more. He didn't need to. His restraint said more than a reprimand ever could. And Roberts heard it. The chairman thanked both men and prepared to move on. But for a moment, just long enough to be remembered, no one spoke. The Chief Justice looked down at his own hands, now resting flat on the polished wood. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned them upward, as if trying to feel the weight of his own words. The cameras caught the motion. They always do. But what they couldn't capture was the silence that followed, a silence not of defeat, but of recognition, that something had broken, and that, just maybe, something better could begin. The hearing ended without ceremony. No press conference, no victory lap, just a quiet adjournment and the sound of chairs sliding back as people stood, not entirely sure what they had witnessed. Something had shifted, not only in the perception of one man, but in the architecture of trust that surrounded the nation's highest court. Within hours, the footage began to spread, not just on the evening news or in legal newsletters, but across every platform where attention lives now. A 47-second clip of Senator Kennedy's words, "I'm not looking for perfect. I needed honest," overlaid with Roberts's slow, open-handed silence, was shared nearly 18 million times within 2 days. But it was another clip that truly caught fire. A young creator on TikTok had taken Kennedy's line and paired it with archival footage past nominees being sworn in, courtroom doors closing, protesters outside federal buildings. The edit ended with the phrase stamped across the screen in bold white text. Justice is not a trophy. It became a slogan, a hashtag, a movement. Within 10 days of the hearing, the Senate introduced a bipartisan bill requiring a formal code of conduct for the Supreme Court, with enforceable oversight provisions and an independent ethics panel composed of former federal judges, constitutional scholars, and public ethics advocates. It passed the Judiciary Committee unanimously. By the end of the month, it had passed both chambers. The bill, called the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act, did more than codify ethics standards. It triggered a retroactive audit of financial disclosures, travel records, and confirmation documents submitted by sitting justices over the past 2 decades. Names that had once seemed untouchable were suddenly part of an overdue conversation. It wasn't just about who had accepted a gift or who had embellished a credential. It was about the assumption that no one would ever check. Several prominent legal figures who had served on confirmation teams, former White House counsels, committee aides, academic advisors were called to testify. Some admitted they had known, or suspected, or had chosen, in their words, not to make trouble. The public response was swift. This time, it wasn't outrage. It was clarity. People weren't shocked by the existence of power protecting itself. They were surprised, maybe, that someone had finally forced it to stop. And yet, while the headlines circled and think pieces multiplied, John Kennedy didn't do interviews. He didn't give speeches. He didn't even return calls from networks begging for exclusive commentary. Instead, the morning after the hearing, long before sunrise, he walked into his office in the Hart Senate building, coffee in hand, sleeves rolled. By 6:03 a.m., he had begun assembling a team 5 legal aides, 1 ethics advisor, and a rotating panel of retired clerks. Their task review every judicial confirmation packet submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2000 onward. He called it quiet work. Work no one would watch. Work that mattered. He didn't ask for sweeping authority. He asked for a whiteboard, access to archives, and silence. And for a month, while pundits debated legacy and Roberts avoided public appearances, Kennedy and his team combed through records with the kind of focus that didn't make news but built new standards. The staff began calling it the backroom review. It wasn't glamorous, but every morning, the lights were on early. One morning, a reporter managed to catch Kennedy outside the elevator. She asked if he felt vindicated by how everything had turned out. He smiled slightly, not pausing his stride. "Ma'am," he said, "vindication's for boxers and saints. I'm just trying to make sure the next nominee walks in here knowing we're going to read every page." The reporter didn't get a soundbite, but the moment still made its way to Twitter, quoted in Helvetica over a grainy photo. By the time fall came, the committee's culture had changed. New staffers were trained differently. Law schools began adjusting how they prepared clerkship recommendation packets. A legal publisher released a guide titled Ethical Framing for Judicial Nominees. There were still critics. There always are. Some called it overreach. Some called it theater. But for the first time in decades, the court wasn't just an untouchable symbol. It was an institution being re-examined by the body that confirmed it and by the people who paid for it. And in a quiet office, lit by fluorescent bulbs and surrounded by stacks of paper, one senator kept reading. Not because the cameras were still watching, but because the country was. It was late October, when Senator John Kennedy stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of Austin Hall at Harvard Law School. The room was packed, not with senators or journalists this time, but with students, faculty, and alumni people who had come not for confrontation, but for reflection. The air inside was quieter than expected. There was no stage lighting, no dramatic music cues, just wood-paneled walls, rows of legal scholars, and a lectern worn smooth by decades of voices. When Kennedy stepped up, he didn't shuffle notes. He didn't need a script. He looked out at the faces before him, some curious, some skeptical, many simply waiting. He waited too, letting the moment settle before he began. "When I was young," he said, "I thought law was mostly about rules. Then I thought it was about arguments. These days, I think it's mostly about memory, about what we choose to remember, and what we pretend we don't." No one moved. No one whispered. He continued, voice calm. "Even some of you probably watched that hearing last summer. Maybe you saw the headlines, or the clips, or the memes. Maybe you saw a man at the highest level of the judicial branch brought to his knees by a few documents and a couple hard questions. But I don't think that's what happened." He paused. "I think what you saw was the law remembering itself." He let the words breathe before moving on. "There's a phrase I've thought about since then. Law without truth is just power with vocabulary." The line landed differently here, in this place built on citations and casebooks, where precision is currency and language is everything. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He simply looked at them, at future clerks and counselors and judges, and let the sentence hang in the same air where Langdell once lectured and Brandeis once listened. Then, with a slight turn of voice, he said something else. "Before I finish, I want to tell you where this story ends, or at least, where it continues." He glanced toward the side of the stage, where Rachel H., Lynn stood quietly. The room turned to follow his gaze. "This fall," he said, "Ms. Lynn joined your faculty as a visiting lecturer in legal ethics. The woman who once lost an opportunity because the truth was edited out of history is now here to teach the next generation how to keep it in." There was no applause, not yet. Just the kind of silence that means something has landed right where it needed to. Kennedy nodded once, his voice softened. "We don't need perfect people in public service. We need people who remember what truth costs when we forget it." Then he stepped back from the lectern. Not grandly, not slowly. Just enough. He gave the room back to itself. Lynn walked to the podium next. She didn't speak right away. She simply stood, then offered a quiet thank you to the senator as he returned to his seat. And as she looked out at the students, many of them leaned forward, not to be polite, but because they wanted to hear what would come next. No grand gestures followed. No historical pronouncements. Just a simple image as the event ended. Students standing. Some silent. A few clapping softly. One or two nodding slowly. As if something unnamed had just clicked into place. In that old hall, where generations had been taught the language of power, a new understanding had begun to take shape. Not one written in law books, but one carried forward in memory. And in that, the law moved quietly, irrevocably toward something better.